Hello, everyone. This is Justin Smythe from nextbigtrade.com. This is the sector review for March 28th, 2025. Starting off with the Chinese stocks, they continue to look like a new leading sector as this correction gets into its later stages. The KWEB was about in line with the S&P 500 this week, and it's now sold off for 2 consecutive weeks, but it's still above the 10-week moving average, way above the 30-week moving average, where most other sectors are now below this important long-term moving average, along with the S&P 500. So China is really showing massive relative strength here. You can see that down here on the indicator, plotting KWEB against the S&P 500. And basically, it looks like it might find support at this 10-week moving average, or maybe even down here by the time this correction might be over. And then I would expect the Chinese stocks just to resume higher. So, biggest leader in the markets, and I think that's going to continue, especially when this correction is over. I expect Chinese stocks to continue to lead the market higher. FXI is doing the same thing, consolidating high. You can see volume starting to move lower here. And again, it'll probably be under pressure if the S&P 500 remains under pressure over the next couple weeks, but good chance it might find a low around this 10-week moving average. Quantum computing is also holding up better than most other sectors. Interestingly, this ETF has QBTS and BABA actually as its two biggest holdings, which are two of the best looking stocks in the market right now. So, having the two best stocks obviously is helping it hold up. And you can see this looks like just a retest of the 30-week moving average during a major correction. And, I think quantum computing is really set up to be an outperforming sector as well heading out of this correction. So, this one might maybe get a little bit below the 30-week as this correction kind of continues, but you can see the volumes declining here. And I think it's got a good chance of bottoming around this moving average and then resuming higher after this correction. So quantum computing still looking good here. There's been some big pullbacks in the individual stocks, but they are volatile. And overall, though, I think the sector still looks pretty good. We're just in a heavy market right now, and nothing's working on the long side. The one thing that is working on the long side is precious metals. We had an issue back here, discussing the correction opportunity in precious metals. Precious metals had a correction actually starting in November. Had a nice tight consolidation here, broke out, have trended nicely. I thought the US dollar was going to be a headwind for precious metals around here. That didn't play out, and instead precious metals continue to move higher. Volumes are really good on the upside. However, now the problem is that, we're in a 3-month move higher now. We're extended above the 30-week moving average, and we're probably due for at least a consolidation or a correction in the precious metals. Now a lot of people are talking about them after a big rally. So the time to get into stuff is after corrections, and then the time to kind of sell and take profits is after major rallies. And I think precious metals might have a little bit of room to move higher here still, but ultimately I think they're getting very close to a correction here, and that'll time up well with a correction low in the S&P 500. Silver was up 3% this week. It looks like it might be able to break out of this basing pattern. Volume increasing a little bit here, but not great volume still. And we're getting later into this move. The gold stocks barely outperformed the gold this week. That's not really a great sign. You can see how the sellers were starting to take control later in the week as well. This could be some topping action. Some individual gold stocks we're kind of looking like blow off tops type of moves. I think GFI was one good example. And again, I think we're later in the move in precious metals. So I would be taking profits here and looking for a bottom, in stocks really at this point. And the silver stocks really, this is where you're starting to see some trouble. You've got huge volume during a down week. This looks like a failed breakout type of move here. The silver stocks should be outperforming, and instead they're lower on the week, and that's just a divergence that's not ideal for precious metals at this point. The stocks really have not done great, even though precious metals have had a nice rally, and that's probably due to the weak overall stock market. So overall, I think precious metals are later in the move, and I would be looking to rotate out of them at this point. Space stocks, I think this is going to be another leading sector. This one's weaker than China and quantum computing. However, it's still around this 30-week moving average, and there's some individual stocks that are starting to act like they don't want to move lower anymore. So I think, this one might move a little bit lower, but you can see the volumes kind of drying up a little bit here. I think this might be just a retest of a 30-week that resumes higher. Once this correction is over, you can see how space emerged out of this big basing pattern back in September 2024, had a nice stage 2 uptrend. Now we're just in a big stock market correction, but this is the first retest of the 30-week. So good odds this is going to resume higher, and I think there's individual stocks that are looking pretty good here. Then finally, bonds, flight to safety type of action with TLT reversing end of the week, holding these key moving averages. Bond lower interest rates are kind of what a lot of people think might help the overall economy, obviously, and it did hold up below these long-term moving averages here. Perhaps TLT is ready to kind of resume higher here. And then like the high yield bonds are the ones that are starting to roll over here. And this happens during weak periods in the stock market where the riskier stuff finally gets sold off in the bond market. And that's what's kind of going on here. It's breaking below the 10-week moving average, starting to see an increase in selling pressure. Same thing with high yield bonds. You can see the bigger selling pressure here, rolling over below the 10-week. So a little bit of trouble in the bond market, and that's kind of coinciding with this correction that's getting deeper in the stock market. So overall, I think the leading sectors are really starting to show up here for the next cycle. Chinese stocks, quantum computing, and probably space are three good targets. That can still change, obviously, going forward. You never really know until you get to the bottom, what's going to emerge, but I think we're seeing some early action here that's indicative of what might happen after this correction. And we just have to get past this correction. It's really what's holding everything back. Earlier in the week, we saw some of these sectors started to rally, but they just fizzled out, and they're not going to be able to make headwind until this correction in the S&P 500 is over with.